Before the age of penthouses and glass towers, before luxury became synonymous with height alone, a quiet revolution unfolded above the streets of America's great cities. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as fortunes rose faster than traditions could adapt, the wealthy faced an unexpected dilemma. Their private mansions were becoming burdens. Land was scarce, staff was costly, cities were growing upward, whether society approved or not. Out of this tension emerged a new idea that would permanently reshape elite living: palaces in the sky. Apartment buildings designed not for necessity, but for status. Residences that promised all the grandeur of a private mansion without its endless responsibilities. These buildings challenged social norms, shocked conservative critics, and quietly redefined what it meant to live well in an American city. Today, we explore the Gilded Age apartment houses that changed luxury forever. The experiments that succeeded, the risks that failed, the families who dared to live above one another, and the architects who convinced them it could be done without sacrificing prestige. If stories like this fascinate you, take a moment to subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and it ensures you won't miss future explorations into the hidden history of wealth, architecture, and power. And as always, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Luxury apartments did not begin as symbols of aspiration. They began as compromises. In the early 1870s, the American elite still clung to the belief that respectability required a front door that opened directly onto the street. A single-family home was proof of independence, lineage, and social standing. To live in an apartment was to accept proximity to strangers, shared walls, shared entrances, shared lives. That arrangement, many believed, was suitable only for immigrants and the working poor. Yet cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago were changing too quickly for old ideals to remain practical. Land values soared. Townhouses crept farther north each decade. Maintaining a private mansion required armies of servants, constant repairs, and enormous expense. Meanwhile, Europe offered a different model. In Paris and Vienna, aristocrats lived comfortably in grand apartment houses without social penalty. The building, not the individual residence, carried the prestige. American developers watched closely. They understood that wealth alone would not persuade elites to abandon tradition. These new buildings would need to feel unmistakably superior to private homes. They would need space, privacy, and services so comprehensive that living alone would seem inefficient by comparison. The first attempts were cautious. Early luxury apartments were designed to resemble stacked townhouses, their interiors deliberately individualized to avoid the appearance of uniformity. No two units were identical. Corridors were hidden. Servants had separate staircases. Carriages passed through gated courtyards rather than stopping at public sidewalks. Everything was engineered to preserve hierarchy, even within shared walls. Critics mocked these early experiments. Newspapers derided them as follies. Society columnists predicted failure. But tenants arrived anyway: lawyers, financiers, merchants newly enriched by industry, families who valued convenience over ceremony. Slowly, a waiting list replaced skepticism. By the 1880s, the idea of elite apartment living was no longer theoretical. It was profitable. And once profitability was proven, ambition followed. Architects began designing buildings not merely to house wealth, but to announce it. Facades grew heavier, more ornate, deliberately evoking European palaces. Towers rose above surrounding streets. Rooflines bristled with gables and chimneys, visual declarations that these were not ordinary residences. They were fortresses of privilege. Inside, these buildings functioned like self-contained worlds. Private dining rooms rivaled elite clubs. Central heating eliminated coal dust and labor. Elevators removed the stigma of height. Uniformed staff handled everything from laundry to repairs. Residents could live surrounded by luxury without managing it. This was the true innovation. Not height, but effortlessness. By the turn of the century, luxury apartments had spread beyond New York. Chicago embraced them after the fire reshaped its skyline. Boston adopted them cautiously, favoring restraint over spectacle. San Francisco's elite experimented with apartment living, even as earthquakes reminded them of architecture's fragility. Each city adapted the model to its own culture, but the principle remained the same. The apartment had become a statement. Living above others no longer suggested compromise. It suggested modernity, control, confidence in the future. These buildings attracted families who believed wealth should simplify life, not complicate it. Over time, they also attracted artists, intellectuals, and cultural figures who valued privacy and scale over suburban isolation. By the early 20th century, the palace apartment was no longer controversial. It was inevitable. And yet, many of these buildings were fragile in ways their builders never anticipated. Changing tastes, economic collapse, rising maintenance costs. Some would survive by adapting. Others would fall to demolition, their grandeur deemed obsolete by newer visions of luxury. The story of these palaces in the sky is not just about architecture. It is about how wealth adapts when tradition becomes inconvenient, about how cities force reinvention, about the moment when privacy, prestige, and proximity learn to coexist. This transformation would not stop with the Gilded Age. It would echo through the Art Deco towers of the 1920s, the celebrity enclaves of mid-century Manhattan, and the glass penthouses of today. But it began here, in brick and stone, in skepticism and ambition, in buildings that dared to suggest that sharing walls did not mean sharing status, and once that idea took hold, luxury living would never return to the ground. By the 1890s, the question was no longer whether wealthy Americans would live in apartments, but how grand those apartments could become. Once the social barrier cracked, competition took over. Developers were no longer content to prove acceptability. They wanted dominance. The new luxury apartment house became a weapon in a silent status war, each structure attempting to outdo the last in scale, ornament, and prestige. Location was the first battlefield. In New York, proximity to Central Park became essential. The park offered controlled nature, unobstructed views, and a permanent buffer against commercial encroachment. An apartment overlooking trees and sky could claim an advantage even the grandest townhouse could not match. Buildings rose deliberately along park edges, advertising their vistas as much as their interiors. Height was no longer feared, it was curated. Design followed psychology. Architects understood that elites needed reassurance. Shared living could not feel communal. It had to feel selective. Entrances were monumental, often recessed behind arches or courtyards that screened residents from the street. Visitors passed through gates, porticos, and uniformed staff before ever glimpsing a hallway. The message was clear. Entry was controlled. Inside, circulation systems reinforced social order. Residents used grand staircases and passenger elevators. Servants used separate routes entirely. Kitchens were positioned away from formal rooms. Service corridors allowed staff to appear when needed and vanish instantly afterward. These buildings preserved hierarchy with almost scientific precision. Nothing was accidental. The apartments themselves rejected standardization. Wealthy tenants expected homes that reflected individual identity. Floor plans varied wildly. Some units spanned entire floors. Others combined multiple exposures for light and air. Fireplaces were carved from imported marble. Ceilings soared. Materials were chosen not just for durability, but for symbolism. Mahogany suggested stability. Oak implied tradition. Bronze and brass signaled permanence. Services became the true luxury. Central heating eliminated coal deliveries and ash. On-site power plants ensured reliability. Laundry services removed domestic labor from daily life. Some buildings offered dining rooms staffed by professional chefs, allowing residents to dine communally or privately without maintaining kitchens of their own. This blurred the line between residence and elite hotel, while preserving the illusion of domestic privacy. Critics still existed, but their arguments were changing. They no longer dismissed apartments as inherently inferior. Instead, they warned that these buildings concentrated too much wealth in too little space. Fire hazards, moral decay, social isolation disguised as convenience. Yet the market responded decisively. Waiting lists lengthened, rents climbed, the buildings proved resilient. What truly distinguished these early palace apartments was their permanence. Developers built them to last generations. Thick masonry walls, redundant systems, conservative engineering. These were not speculative structures meant to turn over quickly. They were monuments intended to outlive their creators. That confidence shaped everything from construction budgets to aesthetic choices. Families moved in expecting to stay for decades. Children grew up within the same walls where their parents entertained. Some apartments passed from one generation to the next. The building itself became part of family identity, an inherited address as meaningful as a surname. By the end of the 19th century, luxury apartment living had quietly won. The elite no longer justified their choice. They simply lived. And in doing so, they redefined what permanence, prestige, and privacy meant in a modern city. As the 20th century approached, the palace apartment evolved from an experiment into a blueprint. What had once been daring became expected. New buildings no longer asked permission from society. They assumed acceptance and built accordingly. The question shifted from whether luxury apartments belonged in elite life to how powerfully they could shape it. Technology accelerated this transformation. Elevators grew faster and more reliable, freeing architects from the constraints of stair-bound design. Electricity replaced gas lighting, eliminating soot and allowing for safer, brighter interiors. Centralized heating and plumbing systems became more sophisticated, reducing the need for vast servant staffs. These advances did more than add comfort. They removed friction from daily life, making height and density feel natural rather than burdensome. With these changes came a new confidence in vertical living. Buildings grew taller. Views became central selling points rather than incidental perks. Upper floors, once avoided, became the most coveted. Height conveyed authority. To live above the city was to rise above its noise, its crowds, its unpredictability. Architectural language adapted to this ambition. Facades became grander, more symbolic. Renaissance revival, Beaux-Arts classicism, and Gothic references were deployed strategically. These styles conveyed lineage, stability, and cultural legitimacy. Even newly wealthy industrialists could project old-world refinement through stone and ornament. The building did the social work for them. Interiors followed suit. Apartments were designed not merely as living spaces, but as stages for social performance. Drawing rooms accommodated formal gatherings. Libraries and studies projected intellect. Dining rooms allowed for ceremonial meals without dependence on clubs. These spaces reinforced the idea that apartment living was not a retreat from society, but a new way to host it. At the same time, discretion remained essential. The elite wanted visibility on their own terms. Many buildings restricted public access, enforced strict visitor protocols, and cultivated reputations for silence. Privacy became a luxury equal to space. In an era of growing urban crowds, the ability to withdraw without leaving the city was priceless. This balance between visibility and seclusion attracted a new type of resident. Beyond financiers and merchants came writers, composers, and artists. These individuals valued proximity to cultural life without surrendering solitude. The palace apartment offered both. Thick walls muffled sound. Large rooms accommodated creative work. The building itself provided a buffer between public persona and private self. By the 1910s, luxury apartment living had reshaped entire neighborhoods. Districts once dismissed as peripheral became fashionable because the right buildings stood there. Development followed prestige, not the other way around. A single successful apartment house could transform an address overnight. Yet this success carried risks. Maintenance costs were enormous. Services promised in promotional materials became obligations. Economic downturns exposed vulnerabilities. Buildings designed for permanent prosperity now faced uncertain futures. Still, the idea endured. Even as tastes shifted, the core promise of the palace apartment remained intact. It offered something no single-family home could replicate in a dense city: scale without exposure, grandeur without isolation, control without retreat. Luxury had learned to rise, and it would not descend again. By the outbreak of the First World War, palace apartments had become embedded in the social fabric of elite urban life. They were no longer novelties, they were institutions. But war has a way of exposing what prosperity hides, and the Gilded Age model faced its first true test when global conflict disrupted wealth, labor, and certainty. Many residents retained their apartments during the war years, but the culture surrounding them shifted. Large staffs became harder to maintain as men left for military service and women entered new roles. Imported materials grew scarce. Coal shortages strained heating systems. The effortless luxury promised by these buildings required constant adjustment. Yet, the very fact that they endured reinforced their status. These were structures built to withstand pressure, both physical and social. After the war, a new generation inherited these spaces. Sons and daughters of Gilded Age fortunes returned from Europe with altered tastes. They had seen Paris, London, Rome. They had lived in grand apartments abroad and now expected the same sophistication at home. This demand fueled a second wave of elite apartment construction, even grander and more centralized than before. The 1920s marked a decisive shift. The palace apartment merged with the emerging skyscraper. Height was no longer just a convenience, it became spectacle. Buildings like cooperative towers rose higher than anything their 19th-century predecessors could have imagined. Yet, they retained the same underlying principles: privacy, service, prestige, and control. The sky itself became a luxury amenity. Cooperative ownership transformed the relationship between resident and building. Instead of renting from a distant landlord, elites became shareholders. This reinforced exclusivity. Admission was no longer determined by wealth alone, but by social compatibility. Boards formed. Interviews became rituals. Silence and discretion were enforced not by staff, but by peers. This system appealed deeply to the elite psyche. It offered autonomy without exposure, power without publicity. The building became a private club disguised as housing, and unlike clubs, it could be inherited. Architecturally, the interwar palace apartments softened in tone. Ornament remained, but excess gave way to refinement. Art Deco lines replaced heavy revivalism. Interiors emphasized proportion over decoration. Luxury became quieter, more assured. These buildings did not need to announce wealth. They assumed it. Then came the crash. The Great Depression tested every assumption that had built the palaces in the sky. Fortunes evaporated. Maintenance fees went unpaid. Staff was dismissed. Some buildings survived only through extraordinary sacrifice by residents who refused to abandon them. Others failed. Apartments were subdivided. Dining rooms closed. Services vanished one by one. Yet, even in decline, the palace apartment proved resilient. Its bones were too strong to erase. Thick walls, generous proportions, prime locations. What had been designed for extravagance adapted to restraint. Where once servants moved quietly through corridors, now families managed their own lives. The architecture endured even as the lifestyle transformed. By the end of the 1930s, the era that created these buildings had passed. But the idea had not died. It had simply matured. Luxury apartment living was no longer a rebellion against tradition. It was tradition. The palaces in the sky had outlived the Gilded Age itself. When the Second World War arrived, the palace apartment entered another period of quiet endurance. Once again, global forces reshaped daily life inside buildings that had been designed for stability and abundance. Blackouts darkened windows that once glowed over city parks. Rationing altered routines. Elevators ran on reduced schedules. Doormen and porters left for military service, replaced by older men, women, or reduced crews. The buildings remained, but the illusion of effortless luxury thinned. And yet, these structures continued to perform their essential function. They sheltered wealth, culture, and continuity in cities that were mobilizing for survival. Unlike private mansions, which often became too expensive to heat, staff, or maintain during wartime, apartment houses proved adaptable. Shared systems reduced costs. Cooperative governance spread responsibility. What had once seemed like compromise now looked like foresight. After the war, American cities entered a new phase. Suburbs expanded rapidly, promising space, privacy, and modern convenience. Many predicted that elite urban living would fade as families fled for lawns and driveways. Some palace apartments did lose residents during this period, particularly those tied to older social patterns. But the form itself did not disappear. Instead, it evolved again. A different kind of elite began to take shape. Diplomats, publishers, media executives, cultural figures whose work required proximity to the city rather than escape from it. These residents valued what the suburbs could not offer: immediacy, access to theaters, studios, galleries, and institutions of influence. The palace apartment quietly repositioned itself as a refuge for those whose power depended on presence. Architecturally, mid-century tastes challenged the old aesthetic. Ornate facades fell out of favor. Modernism promised efficiency, light, and rational design. Glass towers rose, dismissing stone ornament as wasteful nostalgia. Some palace apartments were demolished during this era, sacrificed to zoning changes and developer ambition. Their loss was rarely mourned at the time. Progress demanded space, but others survived precisely because they resisted fashion. Their craftsmanship, their scale, their gravity offered something modern buildings could not replicate. As cities grew louder and faster, the heavy walls and inward-facing courtyards of these older structures became assets again. Quiet returned as a luxury. By the 1960s and 70s, preservation movements began to recognize what had nearly been erased. Landmark designations protected surviving palace apartments from alteration and demolition. What had once been criticized as outdated now carried historical authority. These buildings were no longer just residences. They were artifacts of an era when architecture was expected to express social values. At the same time, exclusivity intensified. Cooperative boards became more selective. Privacy became non-negotiable. In an age of mass media and celebrity culture, the palace apartment offered insulation from exposure. Fame could live behind those walls without spilling into the street. Wealth could exist without explanation. This combination of history and control proved powerful. Prices rose accordingly. Apartments that had once been affordable to prosperous professionals now demanded fortunes. The palace apartment completed its transformation, from experiment to institution to fortress. What had changed luxury forever was not merely the idea of living above others. It was the realization that permanence, privacy, and prestige could coexist in shared space. That a building itself could become a guardian of lifestyle, a silent partner in power. The Gilded Age had built upward out of necessity. The modern elite remained upward by choice. By the late 20th century, the palace apartment had become a paradox. It was old, yet indispensable. Traditional, yet unmatched. Cities had filled with glass towers promising modern luxury, but many of the wealthiest residents continued to seek out buildings erected decades earlier. The reason was not nostalgia alone. It was trust. These older apartment houses had already proven themselves. They had survived depressions, wars, social upheaval, and shifting tastes. Their walls had absorbed history. Their layouts reflected human scale rather than developer efficiency. In a market flooded with novelty, endurance itself became a mark of value. Developers of newer luxury buildings tried to imitate what could not be manufactured. They added concierge desks, private clubs, rooftop gardens, and spa facilities. But services alone could not recreate the authority of time. The palace apartments possessed an invisible asset: social memory. To live there was to step into a lineage, whether acknowledged or not. This lineage shaped behavior. Residents understood that they were custodians as much as occupants. Noise was controlled. Publicity was discouraged. Alterations were debated carefully. These buildings enforced norms not through rules alone, but through expectation. They were self-regulating ecosystems of wealth. Architecturally, their influence spread far beyond their own walls. The idea that luxury should be layered vertically became unquestioned. Penthouses emerged as the ultimate expression of the concept, concentrating privilege at the highest point. The sky itself became stratified. What began as a pragmatic solution to land scarcity had rewritten how hierarchy was mapped onto the city. Yet the palace apartment remained distinct from the modern high-rise. It emphasized mass over height, enclosure over exposure. Where glass towers invited the city in, these buildings held it at bay. They offered refuge rather than spectacle. This difference became increasingly important as cities grew more transparent, more surveilled, more performative. The residents who sought these spaces often shared a common trait. They valued continuity over attention, power exercised quietly, influence maintained without display. The palace apartment did not need branding. Its reputation traveled through whispers, not advertisements. This culture of discretion shaped admissions. Cooperative boards assessed not only financial capacity, but temperament. Could a prospective resident live without drawing focus? Would they respect the silence that protected everyone else? Rejection carried no explanation. Authority did not justify itself. As prices climbed into the tens of millions, the paradox deepened. These buildings were among the most expensive addresses on Earth, yet they resisted the logic of luxury as consumption. They offered no visible excess, no rotating restaurants, no glass-bottom pools. Their appeal lay precisely in what they refused to become. In this way, the Gilded Age apartment houses quietly outcompeted modern luxury. They offered something increasingly rare in contemporary life: insulation from change. Within their walls, the city moved at a different pace. Seasons mattered. Light shifted predictably. The outside world remained present, but never intrusive. What had changed luxury forever was not simply architecture. It was the redefinition of privilege as control rather than display. The ability to choose permanence over novelty, to value discretion over spectacle, to live above the city without needing to announce it. The palaces in the sky had taught the elite a lasting lesson. True luxury does not shout, it endures. As the 21st century arrived, the legacy of the Gilded Age apartment houses became clearer than ever. Cities were taller, faster, louder. Wealth was more visible, more volatile, more publicly performed. Yet, amid this acceleration, the oldest luxury apartment buildings grew only more desirable. Their appeal sharpened in contrast to everything around them. These structures represented a philosophy that modern development often abandoned. They were built with patience, with redundancy, with the assumption that the future would demand resilience rather than reinvention. Thick walls insulated not just sound, but time itself. Floor plans prioritized flow over efficiency. Windows framed permanence rather than spectacle. In an era obsessed with customization, these buildings offered constraint. That limitation was part of their power. Residents adapted themselves to the architecture rather than reshaping it endlessly. This reversal created continuity. Lives unfolded within spaces designed long before them, reinforcing a sense of belonging to something larger than individual ownership. The economics reinforced the culture. Maintenance costs were high, but predictable. Renovations were deliberate, slow, and conservative. Nothing moved quickly. This discouraged speculation. Apartments were not commodities to be flipped, but homes to be held. In a financial world driven by short-term gain, this long horizon became its own luxury. The influence of these palace apartments extended globally. Cities like London, Paris, and Buenos Aires saw renewed appreciation for historic residential blocks that mirrored the same principles. Even new developments borrowed their language. Courtyards returned, private entrances multiplied, services were hidden again. The past quietly corrected the future. At the same time, these buildings began to symbolize something rarer than wealth. They signaled legitimacy, not new money, not sudden success, but arrival. To live in one was to suggest permanence, roots, acceptance into an unspoken continuity that money alone could not purchase quickly. This distinction mattered as fortunes became more fluid. Technology created billionaires overnight. Industries rose and fell in decades rather than generations. Amid this instability, the palace apartment offered anchoring, a physical assertion that some forms of privilege moved slowly, deliberately, and on their own terms. The buildings themselves seemed aware of this role. They resisted adaptation. They demanded respect. Their gates, courtyards, and controlled entrances reminded residents and visitors alike that this was not public space. It was a negotiated sanctuary within the city. What began in the Gilded Age as a solution to overcrowded streets had become a philosophy of living. Vertical, yes, but also inward, protected, intentional. Luxury defined not by what was added, but by what was kept out. The palaces in the sky had outlived every trend that tried to replace them, and in doing so, they revealed a truth that continues to shape elite living today. The future of luxury is often built on the refusal to abandon the past. As the modern skyline filled with glass and steel, the older palace apartments entered a new phase of relevance. What had once been considered heavy, old-fashioned, even excessive, now appeared deliberate and wise. In a city increasingly defined by speed and exposure, these buildings offered resistance. They did not chase trends, they absorbed them and remained unchanged. One reason lay in how they were constructed. Gilded Age apartment houses were engineered with a margin of safety that modern cost models rarely allow. Walls were thick because materials were cheap and labor was plentiful. Foundations were overbuilt because failure was unacceptable. Mechanical systems were designed redundantly because inconvenience was considered an insult to residents. These choices created structures that aged slowly, even gracefully. Cracks appeared, but collapse did not. Fashion shifted, but form endured. Another reason was scale. These buildings were large enough to feel significant, yet small enough to remain intimate. They housed dozens of families, not hundreds. Corridors were quiet. Elevators carried familiar faces. Over time, this fostered a sense of mutual recognition without forced intimacy. Residents shared space, but not lives. That balance proved remarkably durable. By contrast, many modern luxury towers emphasized spectacle over substance. Floor-to-ceiling glass maximized views but sacrificed insulation. Open plans favored flexibility but eroded privacy. Amenities multiplied, yet required constant reinvention to remain impressive. The palace apartments watched this cycle repeat from behind stone facades that had already outlasted a century. Cultural perception shifted accordingly. Real estate listings began to emphasize provenance rather than novelty, original moldings, historic fireplaces, pre-war proportions. These features became shorthand for quality. Buyers spoke less about square footage and more about feeling, the weight of a door, the echo of footsteps, the sense that generations had already lived well here. This emotional dimension mattered. Luxury, at its highest levels, is rarely rational. It is about reassurance, about confidence that one's surroundings will not betray expectations. The palace apartment offered certainty in an uncertain world. It had survived previous eras of upheaval. It would likely survive the next. This confidence influenced behavior within the buildings. Renovations were undertaken cautiously. Materials were sourced to match originals. Changes required approval not just from boards, but from history itself. Residents understood that they were stewards, not just owners. This mindset discouraged excess and rewarded continuity. Over time, this created an unusual inversion. New money often sought modern towers, where customization and visibility were encouraged. Established wealth gravitated toward palace apartments, where discretion and restraint were expected. The buildings themselves filtered their populations without advertising it. This dynamic extended beyond economics into identity. To live in a palace apartment was to accept limits. No dramatic exterior alterations, no attention-seeking displays, no shortcuts. In exchange, residents gained access to something increasingly rare: stability without stagnation. Change occurred, but slowly and collectively. As cities expanded vertically, the palace apartments quietly defined an alternative ideal. Luxury not as expansion, but as concentration. Not as novelty, but as refinement. Not as individual expression, but as shared standard upheld over time. This was the enduring legacy of the Gilded Age experiment. These buildings did not merely change how the elite lived, they changed how luxury itself was understood, from something to be displayed into something to be protected. As wealth globalization accelerated in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the palace apartment entered yet another stage of transformation. Capital was no longer confined to national borders. Buyers arrived from every continent, carrying fortunes shaped by technology, finance, energy, and geopolitics. And yet, when these new elites sought permanence in American cities, many bypassed the newest towers entirely. They gravitated instead toward the same Gilded Age apartment houses that had once unsettled 19th century society. This preference revealed something essential about how power matures. New wealth often seeks visibility. Established wealth seeks insulation. Palace apartments provided that insulation better than any modern structure. Their opacity was intentional. Thick masonry concealed sound. Courtyards turned life inward. Heavy doors discouraged intrusion. These buildings were never designed to be transparent, and in an era of constant exposure, that resistance became invaluable. The cooperative model intensified this appeal. Ownership was not transactional alone. It was relational. Prospective residents submitted to scrutiny not from developers, but from neighbors. Financial statements were reviewed, references were checked, interviews conducted. Approval was discretionary and silent. This process frustrated some buyers accustomed to immediate access, but for those admitted, it confirmed something deeper. Residence here was not merely purchased, it was granted. This gatekeeping reinforced a powerful idea. The building itself had agency. It chose who belonged. That notion, deeply unsettling in theory, proved deeply attractive in practice to those who already lived within systems of selection. The palace apartment mirrored elite institutions elsewhere in life. Private schools, exclusive clubs, cultural boards. Entry mattered as much as ownership. Meanwhile, urban life grew denser. Streets grew louder. Surveillance expanded. Social media dissolved the boundary between private and public existence. Against this backdrop, palace apartments offered a disappearing condition: anonymity without isolation. Residents could remain present in the city while remaining absent from its noise. The physical form of these buildings played a critical role. Unlike towers that thrust residents upward into the sky, palace apartments maintained a grounded relationship to the street. They rose, but not aggressively. Their mass communicated solidity rather than dominance. This restraint allowed them to age without embarrassment. They belonged to the city rather than hovering above it. Urban planners and historians began to recognize their broader importance. These structures were not simply relics of wealth. They were case studies in sustainable density. They demonstrated how cities could grow upward without sacrificing livability, how shared systems could support privacy, how permanence could coexist with change. Ironically, many modern luxury developments began to borrow these lessons. New buildings reintroduced courtyards, separated service circulation from resident areas, limited unit counts, reduced transparency. But imitation rarely produced equivalence. What could not be replicated was time itself, the accumulated authority of survival. The palace apartment thus occupied a singular position. It was both historical artifact and living organism. It adapted slowly, carefully, without losing its core identity. That identity was not architectural alone. It was cultural, behavioral, ethical. It demanded restraint from those within it. As cities confront new pressures, climate risk, housing shortages, technological disruption, the palace apartments stand as quiet counterarguments to constant reinvention. They suggest that durability is itself a form of progress. That building once, carefully, may be wiser than rebuilding endlessly. Luxury, in this context, is no longer about novelty. It is about continuity, about occupying space that has already proven its worth. The palaces in the sky remain, not because they resisted change blindly, but because they were built with the humility to expect it, and that expectation may be the most enduring luxury of all. As conversations about housing equity and urban density intensified, the palace apartment occupied an increasingly complicated position in public imagination. To some, these buildings represented excess, a physical reminder of inequality carved into stone. To others, they stood as proof that density itself was not the enemy. The problem was never living together. It was how thoughtfully that living was designed. The Gilded Age architects had confronted a dilemma that modern cities still struggle with. How do you place many people in close proximity without eroding dignity, privacy, and calm? Their answer was not minimalism, but generosity. Space was not treated as something to be squeezed for profit, but as a buffer that allowed coexistence without friction. Hallways were wide, rooms were deep, windows were plentiful. Shared systems reduced redundancy while preserving autonomy. This approach created a psychological effect that modern developments often overlook. Residents did not feel crowded, even when living among dozens of neighbors. The building absorbed the density. It carried the weight so individuals did not have to. That quality, subtle but powerful, explains why many palace apartments feel quieter today than buildings constructed a century later. The question of fairness lingered, however. These buildings had been created for a narrow segment of society. They were never intended to solve mass housing needs. And yet, their success revealed lessons that transcended class. Density could be humane. Shared living could be elegant. Height did not require anonymity. These were architectural truths that applied far beyond the elite. Some cities attempted to translate these lessons into broader housing policy. Courtyard apartments, mid-rise residential blocks, buildings that prioritized light, air, and circulation over sheer unit count. Results varied. Without the budgets of Gilded Age patrons, compromises were inevitable. But the influence was unmistakable. The palace apartment had quietly shaped how urban planners imagined livable density. Within the elite buildings themselves, culture continued to evolve. New generations inherited apartments not just as assets, but as responsibilities. Renovations balanced modernization with preservation. Climate control systems were discreetly upgraded. Wiring was replaced. Sustainability entered the conversation, though always carefully. Solar panels did not sprout on historic roofs. Instead, improvements were hidden, integrated, respectful. This restraint frustrated some observers. Why not adapt more aggressively? Why not open these buildings to broader use? The answer lay in their core identity. Palace apartments were never neutral spaces. They were curated environments governed by consensus and tradition. Their purpose was not to respond quickly, but to endure deliberately. That endurance shaped relationships among residents. Disputes were resolved internally. Decisions unfolded slowly. The building functioned as a small polity, governed by precedent as much as by rules. This internal governance mirrored the social institutions that residents often belonged to elsewhere: boards, foundations, trusts. Power expressed through continuity rather than disruption. Over time, the presence of these buildings influenced entire neighborhoods. Streets around them stabilized, commercial activity adapted to their rhythms. Schools, cultural institutions, and services followed. The palace apartment acted as an anchor, signaling permanence in districts otherwise subject to rapid change. This anchoring effect became increasingly valuable as cities faced volatility. Real estate cycles accelerated. Neighborhoods transformed within years rather than decades. Amid this churn, palace apartments remained fixed points. They did not prevent change, but they slowed it. They absorbed pressure rather than amplifying it. For residents, this offered a rare form of security. Not the security of isolation, but of predictability. The city outside might reinvent itself repeatedly, but the view from their windows changed only with the seasons. Trees grew taller. Buildings rose and fell in the distance. The immediate environment remained stable. This stability was not accidental. It was the product of decisions made long ago by architects and patrons who believed that buildings should last longer than their creators. That belief, unfashionable in many eras, proved prescient. As urban life continues to grapple with questions of scale, equity, and sustainability, the palace apartments stand as reminders that some answers already exist. They are imperfect, exclusive, and rooted in inequality. But they also demonstrate that density need not be dehumanizing, and that shared space can still feel private. In that tension lies their enduring relevance, not as models to be copied wholesale, but as arguments carved in stone. Arguments for patience, for generosity, for building as if the future will arrive and stay. As the cultural meaning of luxury continued to evolve, the palace apartment became less about opulence and more about authorship. These buildings were no longer simply places to live. They were narratives, written over generations by the people who occupied them and the events they quietly absorbed. Every corridor carried memory. Every renovation layered another chapter onto an existing story. This accumulation of history altered how residents understood ownership. An apartment in a palace building was not a blank canvas. It arrived with constraints, expectations, and inherited character. Some buyers found this limiting. Others found it grounding. The walls had already witnessed lives fully lived. That awareness subtly reshaped how new residents approach their own presence within the space. Unlike modern luxury developments, which often promise reinvention at every turn, palace apartments discouraged erasure. Original moldings were preserved. Floor plans were respected. Changes required negotiation not only with boards, but with the building's identity. The result was a form of continuity rare in contemporary urban life. Each generation adapted, but none erased what came before. This continuity fostered a particular emotional relationship to space. Residents spoke of their apartments not as assets, but as inheritances, even when no legal lineage existed. The building itself supplied a sense of belonging that transcended individual tenure. People moved in knowing others had lived there before them and would live there after. That perspective softened the urgency of ownership and replaced it with stewardship. In this way, the palace apartment subtly resisted one of modern capitalism's most dominant impulses: disposability. These buildings were never meant to be replaced quickly. They were meant to accumulate value slowly, through care rather than reinvention. That philosophy extended to the way residents treated one another. Stability encouraged patience. Familiarity discouraged excess. The social environment inside these buildings reflected this rhythm. Residents often knew one another by recognition rather than intimacy. Names were exchanged sparingly. Privacy was respected instinctively. Encounters were polite, brief, and contained. This was not community as performance. It was coexistence as agreement. Over time, this culture attracted individuals who valued boundaries, writers who needed silence, musicians who required acoustic protection, diplomats who depended on discretion, business figures whose influence thrived away from attention. The palace apartment did not amplify identity, it muted it. In a world increasingly driven by exposure, that muting became desirable. This desire for containment reshaped the market itself. Apartments in palace buildings began to trade less frequently. Owners held them through market cycles. Sales were often private, word-of-mouth transactions rather than public listings. The building's reputation mattered more than its amenities. Buyers were not comparing features. They were seeking admission into a particular atmosphere. That atmosphere proved remarkably durable. Even as neighborhoods transformed around them, palace apartments preserved internal continuity. Retail streets shifted. Traffic patterns changed. Demographics evolved. Inside, the experience remained largely unchanged. The same entrances, the same rhythms, the same silence. This durability also protected value in unexpected ways. During periods of economic instability, palace apartments often retained desirability when flashier developments faltered. Their appeal did not rely on novelty. It relied on trust. Buyers believed these buildings would still matter decades later because they already had. Urban historians began to describe these structures as social infrastructure rather than mere housing. They stabilized neighborhoods. They slowed displacement. They anchored cultural memory. Their exclusivity, while problematic, also insulated them from rapid speculative turnover. This paradox made them difficult to categorize within conventional debates about housing. They were neither solutions nor symptoms alone. They were artifacts of a particular moment that continued to exert influence far beyond it. Their presence challenged simplistic narratives about density, luxury, and urban life. They demonstrated that shared living could be both private and permanent. That height could coexist with intimacy. That restraint could signal power more effectively than display. As cities confront future uncertainties, from climate stress to demographic shifts, the palace apartment offers an alternative vision of resilience. Not adaptability through constant change, but adaptability through careful continuity. These buildings did not anticipate every future condition. They anticipated the need to endure. That endurance remains their most persuasive argument, not because they are perfect, but because they have already lived through what many modern structures have yet to face. Time did not invalidate them. It clarified them. In the skyline, they may appear static. In reality, they are still working, still shaping behavior, still defining what luxury means when novelty fades. The palaces in the sky continue to stand, not as monuments to excess, but as evidence that some ideas, once built carefully enough, never need replacing. As attention increasingly turns toward the future of cities, the palace apartment occupies a strange but instructive place in that discussion. These buildings were never designed with sustainability in mind, at least not in the modern sense. Their creators did not speak of carbon footprints or energy efficiency, and yet, by the standards of longevity and reuse, they have proven remarkably sustainable in practice. Their greatest environmental virtue is simple endurance. A building that lasts 140 years avoids the enormous ecological cost of demolition and reconstruction. The energy embedded in their stone, brick, and timber has been amortized across generations. While newer buildings boast advanced systems, many are replaced within decades. The palace apartment, by contrast, continues to function within its original shell, adapting internally while preserving its core structure. This adaptability without erasure has become increasingly relevant. As cities seek to reduce waste and preserve character, these buildings demonstrate that progress does not always require replacement. Wiring can be updated, heating systems can be modernized, windows can be restored rather than discarded. The framework allows for evolution without loss. Climate resilience has also become an unexpected strength. Thick masonry walls moderate temperature naturally, reducing reliance on mechanical systems. Deep-set windows limit solar gain in summer and retain heat in winter. Courtyards improve airflow. These passive design features, once intended for comfort and fire safety, now align closely with sustainable design principles. At the same time, these buildings reveal the limits of preservation. Retrofitting historic structures for modern, environmental standards is complex and expensive. Landmark restrictions constrain change. Residents often resist visible alterations. The balance between conservation and adaptation remains delicate. But the very fact that these debates occur within the same buildings century after century underscores their relevance. Social sustainability matters too. Palace apartments have sustained not just structures, but cultures. They have preserved ways of living that emphasize restraint, privacy, and continuity. In an age of rapid turnover and digital distraction, these values feel increasingly rare. The buildings enforce them quietly, through design rather than regulation. This enforcement is subtle but powerful. Long corridors discourage loitering. Thick walls discourage intrusion. Shared governance encourages negotiation rather than confrontation. Over time, residents internalize these rhythms. Behavior adapts to space. The building shapes its occupants as much as they shape it. This relationship challenges modern assumptions about choice and customization. Contemporary luxury often emphasizes personal expression. Palace apartments impose limits. Those limits, paradoxically, create freedom. Freedom from noise, from surveillance, from constant reinvention. The resident does not need to define the space repeatedly. The space already knows what it is. This dynamic helps explain why palace apartments continue to attract individuals at moments of transition. Retirees seeking stability, artists seeking quiet, executives stepping back from public roles. These buildings offer a kind of decompression chamber within the city, a place where life can slow without withdrawal. The exclusivity that defines these buildings remains controversial. It cannot be separated from their history. They were built for wealth, by wealth. They continue to serve a narrow segment of society. Acknowledging their architectural and cultural success does not erase that reality, but it does complicate it. These buildings show that density itself is not the problem. Thoughtless density is. They demonstrate that shared living can preserve dignity when designed with care. That luxury need not be extractive to be enduring. These lessons matter beyond elite housing. They inform how cities might approach future growth more humanely. Urban planners increasingly cite historic residential blocks as evidence that mid-rise, high-quality density can outperform both sprawl and super towers. The palace apartment sits at the center of that argument. It is proof that cities once built with patience can remain livable across centuries. As pressures mount to accommodate growing populations and shifting climates, the question becomes not how to replicate these buildings exactly, but how to recover their priorities. Durability over speed, generosity over efficiency, continuity over disruption. The palace apartment was not designed to be inspirational. It was designed to work. That it continues to do so long after its creators are gone may be its most important contribution to the future of luxury and of cities themselves. What endures, these buildings suggest, is not style or status, but structure. The willingness to build as if people will still be living here long after the present moment has passed. And that assumption, once made in stone and timber, continues to shape the skyline quietly, year after year. As the meaning of home continues to shift in an era of remote work, digital presence, and global mobility, the palace apartment has revealed yet another dimension of its lasting influence. These buildings were conceived in a time when home was assumed to be permanent, when movement was slower and belonging was anchored to place. Against expectations, that assumption has regained relevance. Modern wealth is increasingly untethered. People move easily between cities, countries, even continents. Residences multiply. Homes become interchangeable. And yet, within this fluidity, the palace apartment offers something fixed. It does not adapt itself to transient lifestyles. It insists on being inhabited deliberately. That insistence has become part of its appeal. These buildings reward those who commit to place. Their rhythms are not designed for constant turnover. Renovations take time. Governance requires participation. Relationships, even minimal ones, accumulate. Living there means accepting a slower form of urban existence. For individuals accustomed to speed and scale, this deceleration can feel either restrictive or deeply restorative. The interiors reinforce this effect. Rooms are defined rather than open-ended. Walls create separation. Doors close. Activities are compartmentalized. This spatial discipline contrasts sharply with contemporary design that favors flexibility and constant visibility. The palace apartment restores a sense of sequence to daily life. One moves from room to room with intention. Private remains private. Work and rest do not bleed endlessly into one another. This spatial clarity has gained new significance as homes absorb functions once external. Offices, studios, gyms, classrooms. The palace apartment was never designed for multitasking in the modern sense, yet it accommodates these roles surprisingly well. Its scale allows separation. Its sound insulation protects concentration. Its permanence discourages constant rearrangement. The building itself participates in this containment. Thick walls mute the city. Courtyards internalize movement. Entrances slow transition between public and private. These features reduce cognitive noise. Residents often describe a sense of crossing a threshold when entering. The outside world recedes. The building takes over. This quality has become increasingly valuable in cities where boundaries are eroding, where work follows people home digitally, where surveillance and self-presentation never truly pause. The palace apartment creates an analog refuge, not by rejecting modernity outright, but by filtering it. Even technology is absorbed selectively. Internet infrastructure is upgraded discreetly. Security systems integrate without spectacle. Climate control improves without altering appearance. The building accepts what it must, while refusing what it does not need. This selective adaptation mirrors the mindset of its residents. Convenience without surrender. Access without exposure. The social implications are subtle but profound. These buildings do not encourage networking. They do not foster community as performance. Instead, they enable coexistence without obligation. Neighbors recognize one another. They exchange courtesies. They rarely intrude. In an age where connection is often compulsory, this restraint feels radical. This does not mean isolation. It means autonomy. The freedom to engage with the city intensely, then retreat fully. The palace apartment supports both modes without privileging one over the other. It does not demand participation. It permits it. As cities grapple with mental health, burnout, and the pressures of density, this model offers an alternative understanding of urban well-being. Not escape, not expansion, but containment done well. Shared space designed to protect individual interiority. These buildings were never marketed this way. Their creators spoke of luxury, efficiency, prestige. Yet what they ultimately produced was something deeper. A spatial philosophy that acknowledged human limits, that recognized the need for separation within proximity, that assumed people would want to withdraw without leaving. This philosophy now resonates far beyond the elite context that birthed it. Designers, planners, and historians increasingly point to these buildings as examples of how urban form can support psychological stability, not through abundance, but through boundaries. The palace apartment does not promise transformation. It promises continuity. A place where one can remain oneself while the city evolves outside. That promise has endured across centuries of change because it addresses something fundamental. People want to belong to cities without being consumed by them. They want to live among others without surrendering themselves. They want homes that hold, rather than display, their lives. Long before these desires were named, the palaces in the sky were built to answer them. And in doing so, they changed luxury forever, not by elevating status, but by protecting the self within the city. As the conversation around urban living grows more urgent, the palace apartment stands as a quiet counterpoint to the dominant narratives of crisis and acceleration. Much of the modern discussion frames cities as problems to be solved rather than environments to be inhabited. Density is treated as pressure, proximity as stress, shared space as compromise. The Gilded Age apartment houses complicate these assumptions by demonstrating that density itself is not inherently destabilizing. Poorly designed, density is. These buildings were conceived at a moment when cities were already overwhelming. Streets were crowded. Sanitation was unreliable. Noise was constant. Disease was common. Yet, rather than retreating outward, their builders turned inward and upward. They responded not by dispersing people, but by buffering them. Architecture became a mediator between the individual and the city. This mediation is one of the palace apartment's most overlooked contributions. The building absorbs the city's intensity, so residents do not have to. Thick walls muffle sound. Courtyards redirect movement. Entrances slow transition. Even ceiling heights play a role, giving the body space to breathe. These features create a psychological gradient between public chaos and private calm. Modern residential development often collapses this gradient. Glass walls expose interiors to the street. Open plans blur boundaries. Amenities encourage constant activation. The result can be stimulating, but also exhausting. The palace apartment rejects this logic. It assumes that rest requires separation, not immersion. This assumption becomes increasingly relevant as urban populations grow and space becomes more contested. Cities cannot expand outward indefinitely. Vertical living is unavoidable. The question is not whether people will live close together, but whether that closeness will feel humane. The palace apartment suggests one answer: generosity of space, clarity of circulation, respect for interior life. These principles do not require Gilded Age budgets to be meaningful. They require intention. Hallways wide enough to avoid friction. Windows placed to admit light without exposure. Shared systems designed to serve rather than surveil. The palace apartment embodies these choices at an extreme level, but the underlying logic scales. In this sense, these buildings function as architectural memory. They preserve lessons learned under conditions of rapid growth and social upheaval, not unlike those cities face today. Their continued desirability is not accidental. It reflects a recognition, even if unspoken, that they solved problems we are still trying to address. At the same time, the palace apartment exposes contradictions. Its success depended on exclusion. Its calm was purchased through privilege. Its generosity was afforded by concentrated wealth. These realities cannot be ignored, but they also invite a deeper question. Can the qualities that made these buildings successful be separated from the inequality that produced them? Some contemporary projects attempt this separation. Mid-rise residential blocks that prioritize light and air, developments that limit unit counts to preserve quiet, courtyard housing that creates shared refuge rather than exposure. Results vary, but the influence is unmistakable. The palace apartment continues to shape aspirations even where it cannot be replicated fully. Within the elite buildings themselves, this influence manifests as continuity of behavior. Residents inherit not just apartments, but expectations. Silence is valued. Maintenance is collective. Change is deliberate. These norms persist not because they are enforced aggressively, but because the architecture supports them. Space makes certain behaviors easier and others uncomfortable. This relationship between design and conduct is central to the palace apartment's legacy. It reminds us that architecture is never neutral. It teaches people how to live together. The Gilded Age architects understood this intuitively. They designed not just for comfort, but for coexistence among individuals who prized autonomy. That lesson remains urgent. As cities become denser and more diverse, the challenge of coexistence grows. How do strangers share space without constant negotiation? How do individuals maintain interior lives amid proximity? The palace apartment offers one historical answer: build for dignity first, let density follow. This does not mean romanticizing the past. Many of these buildings were built for a narrow audience. They excluded by design. But exclusion is not the only story they tell. They also demonstrate that shared living need not feel provisional or degraded. That permanence matters. That investment in quality pays dividends across generations. As urban life continues to evolve, the palace apartment remains less a model than a reference point. A reminder that cities once built homes with the expectation that people would stay. That architecture could shoulder responsibility for comfort, privacy, and continuity. In an era obsessed with adaptability, these buildings offer a different virtue: stability, not stagnation, but steadiness. The confidence that a place does not need to reinvent itself constantly to remain relevant. The palaces in the sky were built to endure a future their creators could not fully imagine. That they remain instructive today suggests that some problems of urban life are timeless, and that some solutions, once built carefully enough, continue to speak long after the language that produced them has changed. As the story of palace apartments stretches into the present, their most striking quality may be how quietly they operate within cities obsessed with visibility. These buildings do not announce themselves with branding or spectacle. They do not advertise lifestyle packages or curated experiences. And yet, they continue to exert influence over how luxury, permanence, and urban life are understood. This quietness is not accidental. It is structural. Palace apartments were designed to be legible primarily to those inside them. Their grandeur reveals itself gradually through weight, proportion, and sequence rather than immediate impact. A heavy door closes behind you. Sound recedes. Light shifts. The city becomes distant. This transition is deliberate. It trains the body to recognize arrival, not just entry. Modern luxury often eliminates this threshold. Glass lobbies expose everything at once. Transparency replaces ceremony. But in doing so, something is lost. The palace apartment insists that privacy is not merely the absence of others, but the presence of boundaries. It teaches that comfort is cumulative, built from layers of separation that allow the individual to exist without constant awareness of the outside world. This philosophy extends upward through the building. Staircases are not just vertical connectors, but moments of pause. Elevators move deliberately. Hallways do not rush. Even the pace of movement feels moderated. These subtle cues shape daily behavior. Residents slow down without conscious effort. The architecture absorbs urgency. In a city defined by acceleration, this resistance has become a form of power. Palace apartments allow residents to remain embedded in urban life while maintaining control over tempo. One can engage intensely, then retreat completely. Few modern environments offer this duality so effectively. The result is a particular relationship to time. These buildings encourage long thinking. Decisions are made with an eye toward decades rather than quarters. Maintenance is approached as preservation, not optimization. Renovations respect what already exists. This mindset stands in contrast to contemporary development cycles that prioritize rapid returns and visual novelty. Financially, this long horizon reshapes value. Palace apartments are rarely the most liquid assets. They do not change hands frequently. When they do, transactions are often private and measured. This illiquidity is not a flaw. It is part of the appeal. Stability itself becomes a form of return. This stability also affects neighborhoods. Buildings that change slowly anchor districts experiencing rapid transformation. They moderate extremes. They introduce continuity into areas otherwise shaped by speculation. Over time, they become reference points, not just geographically, but culturally. Streets orient themselves around their presence. At the same time, these buildings resist becoming museums. They are lived in. Systems are updated. Comfort improves. But change occurs quietly, incrementally, without erasing identity. This balance between preservation and use is difficult to achieve, yet central to their success. They remain relevant because they remain functional. The residents who choose these buildings often articulate their decision in understated terms. They speak of light, of quiet, of feeling settled. Rarely do they describe luxury directly. This language reveals a deeper shift in what luxury signifies at its highest levels. It is no longer about accumulation, but about reduction. Fewer disruptions, fewer demands, fewer explanations. This reduction is not withdrawal. Palace apartment residents are often deeply engaged in public life. They occupy positions of influence. They contribute culturally and economically. But their homes do not amplify their presence. They contain it. This containment allows public identity and private life to remain distinct. In this way, palace apartments function as instruments of balance. They allow individuals to hold power without being consumed by it, to participate without performing, to live richly without constant display. These qualities are increasingly rare and therefore increasingly valuable. As cities continue to evolve under pressure from population growth, technological change, and environmental uncertainty, the palace apartment offers a quiet argument for another path, one that values endurance over efficiency, depth over surface, boundaries over exposure. It does not promise solutions at scale. It was never meant to. But it does offer clarity. It shows what happens when buildings are designed not just to house people, but to protect their interior lives across time. The Gilded Age architects may not have spoken in these terms, but their work expresses them nonetheless. They built as if life inside mattered as much as life outside, as if privacy was a civic good, as if cities could be dense without being overwhelming. That assumption, built into stone and proportion, continues to shape how luxury is lived today. Not loudly, not universally, but persistently. The palaces in the sky remain, not because they adapted to every change, but because they were built with enough conviction to let change pass around them. As the future of luxury housing continues to be debated, the palace apartment occupies a rare position between relevance and resistance. It does not compete with new developments on their own terms, nor does it retreat into nostalgia. Instead, it persists as a parallel tradition, operating by rules that modern real estate increasingly struggles to replicate. One of the clearest distinctions lies in how these buildings understand value. Contemporary luxury often treats value as something that must be demonstrated continuously. New amenities are added, lobbies are redesigned, marketing language evolves. The palace apartment rejects this cycle entirely. Its value is assumed rather than asserted. The building does not need to explain itself. It has already endured long enough to justify its existence. This confidence shapes the relationship between resident and space. Occupants do not expect the building to adapt endlessly to their preferences. Instead, they adapt themselves to it. This reversal fosters a different kind of satisfaction. Comfort emerges from alignment rather than customization. The resident learns how the building works, how light moves through it, how sound behaves, how seasons register differently in each room. Over time, familiarity replaces novelty as the primary source of pleasure. That familiarity deepens attachment. Palace apartments are not easily interchangeable. Leaving one is not simply a change of address. It is a change of environment, rhythm, and expectation. This emotional gravity discourages casual movement. People stay longer. Lives accumulate. The building becomes part of personal history rather than a backdrop to it. This longevity also influences how conflict is managed. In buildings designed for permanence, disagreements must be resolved rather than escaped. Boards deliberate carefully. Residents negotiate compromises. Decisions take time. While frustrating to some, this process reinforces collective responsibility. The building is not something to be exploited and abandoned. It is something to be maintained together. This collective maintenance extends beyond finances. It includes culture. Norms are upheld not through signage, but through precedent. New residents observe behavior and adjust accordingly. Noise levels, visitor etiquette, use of shared spaces. The architecture supports this transmission by limiting opportunities for disruption. There are fewer spaces designed for spectacle, more spaces designed for passage and retreat. In this way, palace apartments quietly regulate themselves. Their design reduces the need for enforcement by making certain behaviors feel inappropriate rather than forbidden. This subtlety is part of their power. It allows order without constant assertion. The contrast with modern luxury towers is instructive. Many rely on rules and staff to manage behavior that architecture does not support. Gyms, lounges, and rooftop spaces invite constant activity, requiring oversight. Glass walls expose interiors, necessitating curtains and security. The palace apartment avoids these problems by designing for restraint from the outset. This restraint does not imply austerity. The interiors remain generous, materials remain rich, comfort is abundant, but it is delivered without excess motion, without constant stimulation, without the need to impress. As global wealth becomes more volatile, this understated stability grows more attractive. Buyers increasingly seek assets that feel grounded rather than speculative. The palace apartment offers that grounding not just financially, but psychologically. It feels established, it feels safe, it feels known. This perception is reinforced by survival. The building has already weathered cycles of boom and collapse. It has endured changing tastes, technologies, and demographics. Its continued presence suggests reliability beyond market conditions. In an environment where even institutions feel temporary, this solidity carries weight. Yet the palace apartment is not immune to pressure. Rising maintenance costs, aging infrastructure, shifting regulatory demands. These challenges require careful stewardship, but they also force ongoing engagement. Residents cannot be passive. They must participate in the building's future, just as previous generations did. This participation strengthens identity. To live in such a building is to accept a role within an ongoing project. One does not simply occupy space, one contributes to continuity. That expectation filters who arrives and who remains. As a result, palace apartments continue to function as social filters, selecting for individuals willing to prioritize stability over spectacle. This selectivity is controversial, but it is also central to the building's persistence. Without shared values, the architecture alone would not suffice. In the end, the palace apartment endures because it offers a rare alignment between form and behavior, between privacy and proximity, between past intention and present use. It does not promise transformation, it promises holding. And in a world increasingly defined by flux, the ability to hold, to remain intact while everything else accelerates, has become one of the most enduring forms of luxury imaginable. As the idea of luxury continues to fragment into countless interpretations, the palace apartment remains unusually coherent. It does not try to be everything. It does not promise reinvention. It does not chase relevance through novelty. Instead, it offers a complete, self-contained answer to a question that cities have been asking for more than a century. How can power, privacy, and proximity coexist without eroding one another? The answer embedded in these buildings is discipline. Not personal discipline, but architectural discipline. Decisions made once, carried forward consistently. Entrances that do not change with fashion. Circulation paths that remain legible decade after decade. Proportions that feel correct regardless of era. This discipline produces trust. Residents trust the building to behave as expected. That trust reduces anxiety. It allows daily life to unfold without constant adjustment. This is why palace apartments age differently from most luxury housing. They do not become obsolete. They become authoritative. Their design choices, once debated, become unquestioned through repetition. What once felt conservative comes to feel inevitable. Over time, the building's logic becomes invisible, absorbed into routine. This invisibility is essential. True luxury rarely announces itself repeatedly. It reveals itself through absence of friction. Doors close without effort. Sound does not intrude. Light arrives predictably. Systems work quietly. Nothing demands attention. The palace apartment excels at this negative space of experience. It removes disturbances rather than adding stimulation. Modern luxury often misunderstands this principle. It adds features to demonstrate value: pools, spas, lounges, screening rooms. Each addition introduces complexity. Each requires management. Each ages quickly. The palace apartment resists this accumulation. Its luxury is embedded, not appended. Stone walls do not need upgrading. Courtyards do not require rebranding. Silence does not expire. This embedded quality shapes how residents relate to ownership. They do not feel compelled to extract maximum use from the space. There is no sense of needing to justify the expense through constant enjoyment. The value exists whether or not it is actively consumed. This reduces pressure. The apartment does not need to perform. It simply needs to be. This attitude extends outward. Residents of palace apartments often exhibit a similar relationship to the city itself. They engage deeply but selectively. They attend events, meetings, performances. They participate in public life, but they return to a place that does not mirror the city's intensity. The apartment acts as a counterbalance, absorbing excess. This balance becomes more important as urban life grows more saturated. Notifications, crowds, visibility, demands. The palace apartment filters these inputs through architecture rather than policy. It does not block the city. It attenuates it. The result is not isolation, but modulation. Urban theorists have begun to describe this quality as spatial sovereignty, the ability of a space to govern its internal conditions regardless of external pressure. Palace apartments exhibit high spatial sovereignty. Their form protects function. Their identity resists dilution. Their internal culture persists even as the surrounding environment shifts. This sovereignty explains why attempts to replicate palace apartments often fail. Developers copy surface elements but miss underlying intent. Courtyards without sufficient depth. Materials chosen for appearance rather than mass. Floor plans optimized for yield rather than experience. Without commitment to restraint, the result becomes pastiche rather than continuity. The original builders of these apartments did not design for spectacle. They designed for legitimacy. They needed to convince elites that apartment living could support long lives, raised families, aging bodies, shifting roles. That requirement forced seriousness. Shortcuts were unacceptable. What they built had to function across decades. That seriousness is now rare. Development cycles are short. Exit strategies are built into planning. Buildings are designed to be sold rather than lived in. Palace apartments emerged from a different mindset, one that assumed responsibility beyond the immediate moment, one that expected accountability to future residents. This expectation shaped everything. Materials were chosen for longevity. Systems were designed redundantly. Spaces were proportioned generously enough to adapt without reconstruction. These decisions cost more initially, but paid dividends over time. The buildings survived not because they were preserved artificially, but because they remained useful. As cities confront mounting uncertainty, this lesson grows more urgent. The question is no longer how to build faster or taller, but how to build in a way that remains meaningful when circumstances change. The palace apartment offers one historical answer: build less, but better. Build for people, not metrics. Build as if the future will judge you. Luxury, in this context, becomes ethical rather than performative. It reflects choices about durability, restraint, and responsibility. The palace apartment did not set out to define luxury forever. It set out to solve a problem convincingly. That it continues to do so generations later is its quiet triumph. In the end, these buildings endure Because they respect limits, human limits, urban limits, temporal limits. They do not promise endless expansion. They promise holding. And in a world increasingly defined by excess, that promise remains profoundly compelling. As the long arc of palace apartments comes into view, their greatest legacy may lie not in their exclusivity, but in the discipline of their restraint. These buildings were conceived at a moment when wealth was new, confidence was fragile, and legitimacy had to be earned. The result was architecture that took nothing for granted. Every decision carried weight because failure would have confirmed every critic who believed shared luxury was a contradiction. That pressure produced seriousness. Palace apartments were not playful experiments. They were arguments made in brick, stone, and iron. Arguments that wealthy people could live vertically without surrendering dignity. That privacy could be preserved within density. That permanence could exist inside a rapidly changing city. Once those arguments succeeded, they did not need to be repeated. They simply remained. Over time, this seriousness became a defining contrast with later forms of luxury housing. Where modern developments often celebrate flexibility, palace apartments insist on commitment. Where newer buildings invite constant reinvention, older ones ask residents to adapt themselves instead. This is not nostalgia. It is a fundamentally different relationship between people and space. That relationship has consequences. Living in a palace apartment requires patience. Renovations take longer. Decisions involve more voices. Changes must respect precedent. These constraints frustrate some buyers, particularly those accustomed to speed and autonomy. But for others, the constraints are precisely the appeal. They provide structure in a world where almost everything else feels provisional. This sense of structure extends beyond physical space into daily life. Residents plan differently when they expect to stay. They invest emotionally, not just financially. Children grow up knowing neighbors who remain familiar over decades. Rituals emerge quietly. Annual meetings, seasonal maintenance, shared concern for the building's condition. The architecture fosters continuity, not by forcing interaction, but by making long-term presence feel natural. As cities increasingly struggle with churn, this continuity stands out. Many neighborhoods now experience rapid turnover. Buildings change hands, residents rotate quickly. Local memory thins. Palace apartments resist this erosion. Their governance discourages speculation. Their costs discourage casual ownership. Their culture discourages disruption. The result is stability rare in contemporary urban environments. This stability has broader implications. It challenges the assumption that density must produce anonymity. Palace apartments demonstrate that shared living can sustain recognition without intimacy, familiarity without intrusion. People know one another exists. That knowledge alone creates accountability. Architecture makes this possible by balancing exposure and separation with care. The visual language of these buildings reinforces that balance. They are imposing but not aggressive, ornate but not transparent. Their mass communicates seriousness rather than spectacle. They do not compete for attention with the skyline. They anchor it. This anchoring effect becomes more pronounced as cities grow taller and lighter around them. The palace apartment feels grounded by comparison, a counterweight to vertical excess. This grounding has symbolic power. It signals that luxury need not be synonymous with novelty. That value can accumulate through time rather than marketing. That the highest form of privilege may be the ability to remain unchanged while everything else accelerates. The irony is that these buildings were once radical. They disrupted expectations. They challenged norms. Today, they appear conservative precisely because they succeeded. Their once controversial ideas have been absorbed so completely that their origins are forgotten. What remains is a sense of inevitability, of rightness. This is perhaps the clearest mark of architectural success. When a solution becomes invisible because it works too well to question. Palace apartments reached that state decades ago. They no longer need defending. They no longer need explanation. They simply exist, continuing to do what they were built to do. As the future of cities remains uncertain, these buildings offer neither blueprint nor prescription. They do not scale easily. They do not resolve inequality. They do not pretend to be answers for everyone. But they do offer clarity. They show what happens when buildings are designed to last longer than reputations, cycles, or trends. Luxury, stripped of ornament and marketing, is revealed here as reliability, as trust, as the confidence that one's surroundings will not demand constant attention. The palace apartment delivers that confidence through weight, proportion, and patience. In the end, what changed luxury forever was not the idea of living above the street. It was the idea that shared living could be dignified, enduring, and quiet. That a building could hold lives gently over generations. That prestige could reside in continuity rather than display. The palaces in the sky were never meant to dazzle endlessly. They were meant to settle, to stay, to become part of the city's unconscious structure. And in doing so, they achieved something rarer than fashion or fame. They became trusted. That trust is their true inheritance. And it is why, long after the Gilded Age has passed into history, these buildings continue to define what lasting luxury looks like when everything else is allowed to change. As the long presence of palace apartments becomes harder to ignore, their influence can be seen not only in architecture, but in how elite urban life organizes itself around permanence. These buildings quietly shaped expectations about what it means to belong to a city, rather than merely occupy it. They created a framework where residence implied commitment, and commitment implied responsibility. This framework contrasts sharply with the dominant pattern of modern urban living, where flexibility is prized above all else. Leases are short. Interiors are modular. Buildings are marketed as interchangeable experiences. In that environment, the palace apartment stands apart by refusing interchangeability. Each one is singular. Each carries a reputation that cannot be transferred or replicated elsewhere. To live there is not to choose a product, but to enter a relationship. That relationship unfolds slowly. New residents learn the building's rhythms, which windows catch morning light, how sound travels in winter versus summer, when the courtyard fills with leaves, when the heating shifts on. These small recurring experiences accumulate into familiarity. The apartment ceases to feel like property and begins to feel like place. Place, in this sense, is not decorative. It is stabilizing. It gives orientation in a city that constantly reconfigures itself. Streets change, businesses come and go. Neighborhoods reinvent their identities. The palace apartment remains, offering continuity that extends beyond any single life. Residents age within spaces that acknowledge time rather than deny it. This temporal awareness is built into the architecture itself. Materials were chosen to age visibly. Wood darkens, stone softens, metal develops patina. These changes are not treated as flaws, but as evidence of use. The building grows older alongside its residents. This shared aging creates an unusual emotional bond. The apartment is not frozen in perfection. It lives. Modern luxury often resists this process. Surfaces are designed to remain unchanged. Wear is minimized or concealed. Aging is treated as failure. Palace apartments reject this logic. They accept wear as inevitable and design for it gracefully. That acceptance reduces anxiety. The space does not demand constant maintenance to remain worthy. It allows life to happen. This allowance extends to social behavior. Residents are not expected to perform luxury. They are not required to signal status through constant activity or consumption. The building itself carries the signal. Inside, restraint becomes the norm. Silence is valued. Discretion is assumed. The absence of spectacle becomes a shared understanding. This understanding reinforces a particular type of elite identity, not one rooted in novelty or expansion, but in stewardship. Residents come to see themselves as temporary caretakers of something larger than themselves. That perspective influences how decisions are made. Renovations prioritize reversibility. Repairs favor preservation. Changes are debated in terms of decades rather than seasons. Such long thinking is increasingly rare. Economic systems reward speed. Cultural systems reward visibility. Palace apartments operate outside both logics. Their governance structures slow decisions deliberately. Their physical form resists rapid alteration. This friction is not inefficiency. It is protection. Protection of value, certainly, but also protection of atmosphere. Once atmosphere is lost, it cannot be recovered easily. The builders of these apartments understood this intuitively. They invested heavily in details that would never appear in advertisements: sound insulation, proportional balance, hidden service circulation. These choices were not glamorous. They were foundational. Over time, these foundations shaped who felt comfortable within them. Palace apartments did not attract those seeking constant stimulation. They attracted those who valued containment. Individuals whose public lives were expansive often sought private lives that were bounded. The building provided that boundary without requiring isolation. This pattern continues today. In an era of hyperconnectivity, the ability to disconnect selectively has become a form of privilege. Palace apartments offer disconnection through architecture rather than technology. Thick walls replace noise-canceling devices. Courtyards replace algorithms. Physical separation accomplishes what digital tools attempt to simulate. The broader city benefits from this model as well. Buildings that absorb intensity reduce pressure on public space. Residents who can retreat do not demand constant external accommodation. The palace apartment thus functions as a pressure valve within the urban system. It contains density rather than dispersing it. This containment challenges the assumption that luxury housing inevitably worsens urban inequality by driving outward expansion. While palace apartments serve a narrow group, they also demonstrate that high-quality density can reduce sprawl. By concentrating wealth vertically, they limit horizontal consumption of land. This is not a moral solution, but it is a structural one. As cities confront the twin challenges of growth and sustainability, the lessons embedded in these buildings gain relevance. They suggest that density, when paired with dignity, can be desirable rather than oppressive. That shared systems, when designed with care, can enhance rather than diminish privacy. That permanence is not an obstacle to progress, but a form of it. The palace apartment was born from a moment of transition when cities were reinventing themselves under pressure. Its continued relevance suggests that the pressures have not changed as much as we imagine. People still seek stability amid flux, privacy amid proximity, belonging without exposure. These buildings answered those needs once, convincingly enough to endure for generations. That endurance is not accidental. It is the result of choices made with seriousness, humility, and an expectation of time. In the skyline, the palace apartment does not dominate. It anchors. It reminds the city of its own capacity for continuity. And in doing so, it continues to shape how luxury is lived, not as an expression of excess, but as an agreement with time itself. As the palace apartment continues to hold its place in the modern city, its influence can be traced in something less visible than skyline or market prices. It can be found in how expectations around permanence have quietly narrowed. In an age where nearly everything is designed to be replaced, upgraded, or optimized, these buildings insist on another measure of success: They ask not how quickly something can change, but how long it can remain useful without changing at all. This insistence reshapes how residents think about their own lives. People who live in palace apartments rarely speak about maximizing their space. They speak instead about settling into it. The apartment becomes a container for time. Careers begin and end within the same rooms. Children grow up and return as adults. Loss, celebration, illness, and routine all pass through spaces that do not react dramatically to any of it. The building remains steady while life moves. That steadiness creates a psychological effect that modern housing often lacks. It reduces the sense of contingency. The fear that one's environment could vanish, be sold, demolished, or radically altered without warning. Palace apartments were built with the assumption that residents would stay, and that assumption still lingers in how they function today. Governance is conservative, debt is treated cautiously, repairs are planned with longevity in mind. The building behaves as though it expects to outlive everyone inside it. This expectation of endurance affects how residents behave toward one another. Short-term thinking encourages conflict. Long-term thinking encourages compromise. When people expect to share space for decades rather than years, disputes are approached differently. The question is not how to win, but how to continue. Architecture supports this mindset by making exit inconvenient and permanence normal. The physical layout reinforces this social contract. Shared spaces are transitional rather than performative. Hallways are meant for passing, not gathering. Courtyards are places of quiet movement, not entertainment. There is little incentive to dominate common areas. They belong to no one and everyone simultaneously. This discourages territorial behavior and reduces friction. Contrast this with many contemporary luxury developments where shared amenities are designed as attractions. Rooftop lounges, fitness centers, screening rooms. These spaces encourage presence, activity, and competition. They require rules, staff, and constant management. They age quickly as tastes shift. Palace apartments avoid this cycle by limiting shared spaces to what is necessary. Circulation, entry, light. Everything else happens within private units. This design choice reflects a deeper understanding of luxury. That comfort increases when choice is simplified, when residents are not required to navigate a menu of options to feel at home. The palace apartment offers fewer choices, but those choices are stable. That stability frees mental space. The building makes decisions once, so residents do not have to keep making them. Over time, this produces an unusual calm. Not the calm of isolation, but the calm of predictability. The elevator works the same way it always has. The entry feels the same in winter and summer. The courtyard changes only with weather and seasons. These small consistencies accumulate into trust. Trust in the environment reduces vigilance. People relax. This relaxation is increasingly rare in urban life. Cities demand attention constantly. Streets shift. Neighborhoods rebrand. Buildings appear and disappear. Palace apartments interrupt this churn. They provide continuity not only for residents, but for the city itself. They act as fixed points in a landscape of motion. Urban historians often describe such buildings as anchors, not because they prevent change, but because they slow it. They absorb pressure. They stabilize values. They offer reference points against which everything else is measured. This anchoring effect explains why palace apartments often become symbols of their neighborhoods, even when surrounded by newer construction. Their presence also shapes expectations for what comes next. Developers building nearby must respond to their gravity. Height, scale, and materials are considered differently. The palace apartment sets a standard that cannot be ignored. Even when new buildings contrast deliberately, the older structure defines the conversation. This influence extends beyond architecture into cultural imagination. Palace apartments have become shorthand for discretion, legitimacy, and endurance. They appear in films, literature, and journalism, not as novelties, but as constants. Places where power resides quietly, where history accumulates without spectacle. That quiet power is rooted in restraint. The builders of these apartments did not attempt to predict every future need. They focused instead on creating generous frameworks capable of absorbing change without losing identity. That choice proved wiser than endless adaptability. The buildings did not need to reinvent themselves because they were never narrowly defined. As cities continue to face uncertainty, this lesson becomes more urgent. Flexibility is valuable, but only when paired with structure. Adaptation matters, but not at the expense of coherence. The palace apartment demonstrates how to balance these forces. Build with enough generosity that change can occur inside without altering the whole. Luxury, in this model, is not about having everything. It is about not having to think about everything. The building carries responsibility, so the resident does not have to. That transfer of burden is subtle, but profound. The palaces in the sky endure because they were built to shoulder weight, physical weight, social weight, temporal weight. They do not ask residents to keep them relevant. They ask residents only to live, and to leave them intact for whoever comes next. That expectation, once embedded in stone and proportion, continues to shape lives quietly. And in a city defined by motion, that quiet persistence remains one of the most radical luxuries of all.